Today we're going to hear about protecting water in Arizona. So as we get started and as we're letting folks in, feel free to open up that chat window and let us know where you're joining us from. If you have a favorite place with water in the Sky Islands, you can also put that in the chat. Awesome. Welcome, folks. Welcome. Oh, we've got folks joining us from Tanque Verde, someone from Patagonia. Nice to see you online, David. Anyone else from other parts of the Sky Islands, perhaps? Well, I am joining as well as some of our other folks here are joining from Tucson, Arizona, where the Sky Island Alliance office sits on the lands of the Tonopah, Pasquayaqui, and other indigenous peoples. One of my colleagues will be pasting our note into the chat where you can learn more about our land acknowledgement. Oh, Tim's joining us from Tucson as well, near Sabino Canyon. That is one of my favorite places with water in the Sky Islands for sure. Awesome. So as more folks are joining, I do want to mention a short pitch for one of our water-related programs called Spring Seeker. Our program allows volunteers to visit and submit data on springs throughout the Sky Island region. Thus far in 2023, we've already surveyed more than 80 water sources across the southern part of the Sky Islands. Overall, we've surveyed more than 1,000 water sources across the entire Sky Island region since the start of the Spring Seeker program in 2020. And one thing I want to do before we pass it over to our special guest, Dr. Erin Jordan, is I want to recognize some of our star Spring Seekers who are already online with us today and who have already been out in the field. So our top 5 volunteers thus far this calendar year, are Britt Rosso, who's been in the field for more than 25 hours. I should say these numbers are as of the end of March. So in the last 2 weeks, they may have changed. We have Bob Proctor, who's also spent quite a bit of time in the field. Kim Stone, Leif Abrell, and Karen Flynn have all been our top volunteers for Spring Seeker thus far. So I wanted to thank our wonderful Spring Seekers. We can give them a little visual round of applause if your camera is on, or just give them a silent round of applause in the background. Thank you very much for all of your work thus far to monitor and survey springs in the Sky Islands. Additionally, we've had 54 new volunteers join us in all of our projects across all of our programs with Sky Island Alliance. And I'm just so appreciative to these new folks who are joining us to get involved in restoring and protecting water and wildlife across the Sky Islands. Awesome. All right, so back to the task at hand. Thank you. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Dr. Erin Jordan. We all together want to protect surface water in Arizona in the future. So she is going to tell us about how the state and what the state is doing to protect surface waters. This has been a long and turbid path over the past few years because of changes happening at the federal level. And so I've been really impressed with the state level work on this issue, and Dr. Jordan has been really deeply involved in that. In terms of her background, Dr. Jordan is a value stream manager in the water quality division at the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, which we will probably abbreviate ADEQ throughout the talk if you hear us throwing that abbreviation around. Erin has a PhD in Arid Lands Resource Sciences from the University of Arizona and undergraduate degrees in geosciences, botany, and communications from Miami University and Mississippi State University. She joined the agency in 2017 as the media administrator, but then moved into her current role of managing the team monitoring, assessing, and enhancing surface water quality in Arizona in 2020. Today, Erin will talk about the current state of surface water regulation in Arizona and how water quality across the state is protected to ensure ADEQ meets its mission of protecting and enhancing public health and the environment. As a reminder, we're going to ask everyone to stay muted during the talk. But please feel free to type any questions at any time into the chat and we'll address those at the end. So I'm going to hand it over to Erin right now. Go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So today, we're here to talk a little bit about protecting Arizona surface waters. And, we'll kind of look at how we deal with our water quality in protecting Arizona surface waters, not quantity, because ADEQ is quality ADWR, the Arizona Department of Water Resources, is quantity. So we're really focused on the quality of the water in our surface waters. So the story begins with ADEQ's role in regulating surface water. First, we have the Clean Water Act federal program. In general, the EPA delegated authority for the Clean Water Act federal programs to ADEQ to monitor, assess, and permit facility discharges to surface waters that are considered a waters of the United States, or WOTUS. We'll talk a little bit about what WOTUS is coming up. Second, we have a state surface water protection program, or what we call SWIP, SWPP. We nicknamed it SWIP. This is new and went into effect in February of this year. The SWIP was created to protect important Arizona waters, such as those used for drinking water that are not considered a waters of the United States, or WOTUS. The SWIP includes a protected surface waters list, or shortly we call it the PSWL, which lists all regulated waters in Arizona for both the federal and state programs. Now, the PSWL does not include every individual water in Arizona. However, simply because a water is not on a list does not mean it is not protected. It simply means there hasn't been a formal regulatory decision on the water, mostly because it hasn't needed one. We'll cover what this means later in the presentation. First, I want to give you some background into the question of what is WOTUS? What is a waters of the United States? Without going deep into the complexities of WOTUS, and there's a lot of complexities there, my colleague Colleen Cassidy is on the call and she is leading the effort to wade through those complexities right now. Generally, WOTUS is a surface water with flow that could impact the downstream water quality of a traditional navigable water, or TNW, which is always a WOTUS. A TNW is the pinnacle of WOTUS and are the nation's most important and oftentimes the most high profile waters. In Arizona, the Colorado River is a TNW, as are parts of the Santa Cruz and Gila River. There are also lakes considered TNWs. These are Roosevelt Lake, Alamo Lake, and Lake Pleasant, as well as all the lakes along the Colorado River. I need to note that the only agency that can decide if something is a TNW is the U.S. Corps of Engineers. Beyond that, the Corps, EPA, and states can make WOTUS decisions. On the flip side, a non-WOTUS water is one that does not connect to a TNW and will not impact the water quality of a TNW. An example of a non-WOTUS in Arizona are streams that drain into the Wilcox Playa, which is a closed basin and has no connectivity to a TNW. Keep in mind that this is a very general application of the current definition of WOTUS, and that definition has changed in the past due to EPA and Corps of Engineers rulemakings and Supreme Court decisions. Most recently, a new WOTUS rule definition went into effect on March 20th of this year that was done by the EPA and Corps through rulemaking. It was very similar to what was in place prior to the 2015 Clean Water Rule. Also, the Supreme Court is reviewing some elements of WOTUS right now. They have not issued a decision on what WOTUS definition means to them, but we are expecting that decision sometime this spring. We're actually a little surprised it's not out yet because some of the Supreme Court decisions for the other things that were heard in the court have already come out. So we are waiting for that. So things can change with the WOTUS definition. And keep in mind, we're only speaking of the definition as it applies today and in very general terms. The definition can change over time. So that brings me to flow regime, which is a critical part of the WOTUS definition, the current WOTUS definition. Why? Under the current WOTUS definition in the state's SWIP, flow regime of a surface water can inform how a water can be regulated. Flow regime is defined as perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral. Perennial waters run year-round. It's the Colorado River. Intermittent waters run at least seasonally, such as in the spring due to snowmelt. This year, we have a lot of intermittent waters running because of our beautiful winter that we've just had. Think maybe Tanque Verde Creek. You usually see water up near the falls, even when it's on a dry, even when it's a little bit dry. Ephemeral drainages only convey water during or immediately after a storm event. Perennial and intermittent waters that connect to a TNW are clearly WOTUS. Keep in mind a perennial or intermittent water that is not connected to a WOTUS can be non-WOTUS, such as those streams that drain into a terminal basin like the Wilcox Playa. What I want to note here is that just because there's water present does not mean it is WOTUS. Now that gets us to ephemeral drainages. Ephemeral drainages under the current federal definition can be WOTUS if it can be established that there is a significant nexus with a downstream TNW if and when there's water flowing through the drainage or if there is a biological or chemical connection. The physical connection is a bit easier to follow, but there are tools to support biological and chemical connectivity as well. For SWPP, our state program, if a water is determined not to be WOTUS, then there is a chance it could be protected under our state program. However, that's only for intermittent or perennial waters. In Arizona, the legislature approved a SWPP, a state program that excludes ephemeral drainages. ADEQ can only implement the SWPP the legislature approved. We have to follow the law, and the law says we cannot add ephemeral drainages to the program. While your input is important, keep in mind that a state agency cannot change the law and we cannot break the law. That, if you want to change the law, that is done through the legislative process. So just keep that in mind. All right. Let's go over to what does that mean for ephemerals? Oh, my little picture like messed up there. That's okay. Those are my kids and my husband hiking through the canyon to Arizona hot springs along the Colorado River. So what does it mean if an ephemeral drainage is not WOTUS and cannot be listed in SWPP? Does that mean the drainage is not protected? Not exactly. While the physical drainage may not be on a specific list, we need to think about how protection applies to the water that flows through the drainage on those rare occasions when there is water. This year, we're seeing a lot of water, so we are seeing things flow that maybe we don't typically see flow. To understand this better, you need to also understand how we measure the health of Arizona waters and how they are permitted. Oh, I skipped one. Every 2 years, ADEQ is required to send a report outlining the health of Arizona waters to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. This is required by the Clean Water Act. This is called the integrated report, or we call it the assessment as well. We measure the health of waters based on the most recent data, which is usually a 5-year window. In other words, the water samples need to be collected within the last 5 years. This is so we know if water is healthy based on the most recent data. It's important to note that we need multiple samples on a water to determine health. How many samples are needed to measure the health of the water is in the Arizona Administrative Code rule known as the Impaired Waters Identification Rule, or IWIR. If a specific water is impaired farther back than that 5-year window, and if there's no recent data showing it is not impaired, it remains impaired until we have data showing definitively it is now healthy. Now, collecting this data is a big lift. Arizona covers nearly 114,000 square miles. Even though we may not have a lot of surface water compared to other states, we still have to get to those waters to collect the data. And keep in mind, we need water to sample. So much of our sampling efforts are focused on ensuring our perennial and reliably intermittent waters are sampled in that 5-year assessment window. Beyond that, you can imagine how difficult it is to sample an ephemeral drainage. These only have water in them during or after storm events. To sample, we need to be in the right place at the right time. With 114,000 square miles to cover, you can imagine that's quite a mountain to climb, or Sky Island to climb, right? Speaking to the Sky Island Alliance. So what are we protecting when there isn't water in the drainage? That brings us to how we permit under the Clean Water Act and how the new SWPP program ensures the health of Arizona waters. When it is skipping. Likes to skip slides here. When ADEQ receives an application from a facility for a permit to discharge treated water, and that application is not associated with an already regulated water, for example, one that would be on the PSWL versus one that would not be on the PSWL, ADEQ has a process in place to determine if the discharge could reach a regulated water. Even if that discharge is to an ephemeral drainage, the permit may still be required if ADEQ determines pollutants from that discharge may reach a WOTUS or a non-WOTUS state protected surface water. The movement of that discharge through the ephemeral drainage is taken into account and the downstream water quality remains protected. Again, there are lots of ifs, ands, or buts here, but what I want you to take away is that permitting takes a broad view at potential impacts to surface water hydrology. Their view is not narrowed just to the discharge point. And keep in mind that permitting processes do involve public comment. If there are concerns, you can comment on the permit, and ADQ needs to take that input into consideration. In some cases, permits have been updated due to relevant stakeholder comments. We do try and make it really easy for you to find permits in process so you can learn, kind of what's happening in your area with a permits in process web page. That's what you're seeing right here on azdeq.gov. So you can actually go in and see what permits are being drafted, when those public comment periods are, and you can review them and comment on them if needed or if you have a concern. There we go. But what about all the ephemeral drainages that are not impacted by a discharging facility, ones that maybe wouldn't have a permit on them? That's a good question. In general, while these may not be listed in a specific program, that doesn't mean there are not laws in place to protect the watershed in which these are located. At the end of the day, you still can't go out and knowingly pollute the environment, water or no water. Construction and similar projects. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are, oh, it keeps wanting to skip slides on me. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the other protections that are available for waters, even if they're not on a list, if there's not sort of a permitting process. Construction and similar projects apply to the U.S. Corps of Engineers for a 404 permit. These permits are for dredge and fill activities in a WOTUS and are linked to a specific project in a specific area. For example, this is the US 60 bridge prior to completion, just to the east of Phoenix. During permit review, the Corps will determine if there is a WOTUS in the project area or if that project will impact a WOTUS. The Corps permit will ensure activities are protective of water quality for any WOTUS. For example, this protected the water quality of, that's not Pinal Creek, that's, I can't remember which one it is. It starts with a P, I think. It protects the water quality down at the bottom where they're doing all those construction activities and make sure a bunch of sediment and pollutants are not going into that water. That's what that Corps permit did for this particular project. For SWPP, we also have best management practices that will protect non-WOTUS state protected surface waters, similar to what's in the 404 permit, but there's not an official permit for those best management practices. But we can still go out and inspect and determine if people are being protective of water quality in our state program. On public lands, such as those managed by U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service, Pinto Creek, thank you, Patty, Pinto Creek, such as those managed by U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, or BLM, those require some level of environmental review when projects are proposed on those public lands that take into account impacts of watersheds. This review involves public input. ADEQ has provided input on various projects over the years with recommendations to be protective of water quality if we do see these kind of come across our desk. Now, ADEQ also has an aquifer protection program, or APP, to protect groundwater quality, as well as solid waste and hazardous waste regulations at the state and federal level to prevent illegal dumping. And in our federal and state surface water programs, we have what are known as narrative standards versus the more commonly used numeric standards. These narrative standards can be used to ensure water is healthy based on color, odor, or more. It gives us a little more wiggle room to address issues that we may find that don't fit in a nice little box of our numeric standards. Again, at the end of the day, you can't just knowingly pollute the environment. There are a variety of mechanisms in place to protect surface water quality. Oh, always wants to skip. I also get a lot of questions about springs. It is possible you can nominate a spring for SWPP as they are defined in a statute as a waters of the state. In fact, during the development of SWPP, we used the spring-fed Stronghold Canyon Creek as a test case for the economic, social, and environmental cost-benefit analysis, which is a requirement of SWPP and when some waters are nominated for protection. As a result, this water was added to the state program. Or But again, what are we wanting to protect? The water feeding the spring. The groundwater is protected by the Aquifer Protection Program, or APP. Now, what's interesting about the Aquifer Protection Program that I want everyone to note is that this program is not under the Clean Water Act. In general, the federal government has not regulated groundwater. We as a state put a program in place to protect our groundwater resources. And it is a very restrictive program compared to some other states because we protect all our groundwater for drinking water uses. Other states don't do that. Other states don't have programs to protect groundwater necessarily. So that's something that's very unique to our state. Or are you protecting the existence of the spring? Because that's different from SWPP, because again, we're about water quality, not the quantity part of it. That may be covered in the 404 review of any permits the Corps would issue on public or private land, as well as in an environmental review for any projects on public land. If there is water, such as if there is a water, such as a pond or a creek created by a spring, that could be protected under state or federal programs to ensure quality for human use, such as swimming, wading, and for wildlife that uses or lives in the water. But it's really a case-by-case basis. Like for the Stronghold Canyon, we kind of did a test case, an example of how a spring-fed water would be protected. But we need to go through on a case-by-case basis to determine that. So I want to talk a little bit about how you can nominate waters for SWPP. So how do we get waters on the PSWL? How do we know if they're, kind of look at them to see if they're protected in the federal or state program? Well, stakeholders like you can nominate waters, and we are working very hard. My colleague here, Colleen, is leading up the effort to kind of put more definition around that process and make it a little more descriptive for people nominating waters and what information we may need. But keep in mind that we can only add perennial or intermittent non-WOTUS waters to SWPP. That means we need to conduct a full evaluation of the water to determine the flow regime and connectivity to a potential or not connectivity to a TNW. That goes for springs, streams, ponds, lakes, anything out there. We can't list something just on a simple request. We need to do the science first. However, here's the deal. That science is not always black and white. And with a lack of federal guidance around some of the science, we need to make decisions. We are finding it difficult to list some of the nominated waters. We are working to resolve that issue and are engaging at the federal level with requests of additional guidance. And if you want to know more about that topic, that's a whole other presentation. That's a whole other rabbit hole I can certainly get down with you that I can give another day. But I can tell you that the team is problem solving, and we hope to provide additional clarity very soon. I also want to let you know that we've done 2 full WOTUS evaluations thus far. One through a contractor that we determined some lakes were non-WOTUS, and that cost us, I think, between $20,000 and $30,000. Another one we've done on a creek for regulatory purposes, and that we kept that in-house, and that probably took many, dozens, if not over 100 hours to do. So these case-by-case examples are a heavy lift. So we ask that you be patient on our evaluations, and we are developing additional guidance as well. So just keep that in mind. We're getting it done the best we can. So that's the completion of this particular presentation. Thank you for joining us today. And as you can see, all the pictures in my presentation were my pictures. So like you, I go out and seek water in Arizona. And that's kind of what we do on weekends.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. Yeah, for sure. Finding water in the desert is always just absolutely remarkable. Thank you for that. That is a lot. You all have been doing so much work to protect water in a lot of different ways and balancing all these different rules from the federal level to the state level, trying to figure out how all these pieces fit together. So if folks have questions, please feel free to start typing those in the chat. As people are typing out their thoughts, I do have some questions. I think one is just a clarification, and maybe it's based on that case study of that spring that you mentioned. But if the spring does produce a pond or a creek that then supports wildlife or can be used for humans, what about some of our endemic plant species or like the whole ecosystem piece of that? How is that incorporated into a judgment of whether the water should have surface water protection versus groundwater protection?
Generally, we have our designated uses. So we protect waters for designated uses for plants and animals. And if not for plants necessarily, but for animals and bugs and things like that. So we would protect the water for those particular things, which of course would feed off the particular plants or anything that's available in the water. Because to sustain the life in the water, you of course need a healthy water with healthy food available to them. So those are the designated uses. In Arizona, we have designated uses for human health, and we have designated uses for wildlife. We also have designated uses for agriculture as well to protect the health of all of those categories.
Okay. So then I guess related to that question about groundwater and the Arizona Aquifer Protection Program, the idea there that they're protecting both water quality and quantity, or is it a quantity metric primarily?
Oh, can you repeat that?
Oh yeah, sorry. So for the Arizona Aquifer Protection, so I'm thinking about springs again and protecting the amount of water coming out. But is the Aquifer Protection Program also focused on quality, or is there any way to protect the quality of groundwater as it emerges at the surface?
It's on quality. So once
Okay.
it comes up to the surface, it would move into the Surface Water Protection Program. But essentially, we protect our aquifers for quality, especially for potential drinking water. Of course, there can be high mineral content that's very common in Arizona. It might have low pH or low dissolved oxygen because it's groundwater upwelling, things like that. So it's very common to see those things in Arizona.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, we have a couple questions that are popping up in the chat. So the first is from David. When a creek is perennial in one reach, but ephemeral in other reaches, are the reaches regulated differently?
Yes, they can be regulated differently because we break, of course, particular streams, especially the longwoods, into different reaches based on the hydrology. And so an ephemeral reach would have different designated uses. So that would mean there's different regulations than a perennial reach, which may have the designated uses would be the same, but the levels for which protection under the numeric narrative standards could be different. And again, those numeric standards are also different for humans than for wildlife, than for agriculture. So that's all in our rules, kind of how each water is protected and what standards apply. And so it does change based on the flow regime.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Next up from Caitlin, how does ADEQ determine if a notice of violation needs to be given to a construction project for SWPP violation?
That's a really good question. We're actually in the process of developing a sort of a reporting mechanism through our MyDEQ, which is kind of our online portal for reporting for people that want to do work on state surface waters. That would, essentially should trigger us to be aware of that and an opportunity to go inspect. Of course, there's also a system by which you can submit complaints to Arizona or observations, things like that on our website. Oftentimes our regulatory arm, I am not the regulatory arm, our regulatory arm for surface water will get those complaints and they will send someone out for investigation, whether it's WOTUS or non-WOTUS. They'll kind of take a look at it and make sure that things are being followed. And if they're not being followed, they'll move into the notice of violation stage. So that's something that we're very proactive of as an agency, is to go out and kind of look at these issues as they come into us. Now, we can't have eyes and ears everywhere, and that's why we have that complaint option online, is that we allow people to submit those so that we can take a look at them if they do see something that is unusual or perhaps out of compliance, so we can go look at it.
Great, thank you. Next up, are stock ponds entitled to any protection or subject to any regulation? Does it make a difference whether the stock pond is always filled or ephemeral?
Now, my understanding, I have to go look at the statute, but stock ponds are not generally part of that if they're in an upland area. If they are within a water that could be protected, that's another question. And we have been looking a little bit at that because I know Game and Fish sometimes stocks some of those kind of seasonal ponds. So it is something we're kind of looking at with Game and Fish to figure out if it's within a water or if it's an upland dry area that just has the stock pond.
Okay, gotcha. I have an additional question. So I really liked that piece that you talked about, the narrative standards versus numeric standards and having that as an option. But I'm curious how much, I'm just thinking to nominating, if we decide, okay, there's the spring and it needs protections and it doesn't seem to be otherwise protected under any other law right now. for that particular piece, is that case by case heavy lift that you were talking about, does all that have to be done once the water has been nominated? Or are there particular data pieces, especially around those narrative standards, because we don't do water quality samples at our Spring Seeker program? So some of that stuff we might collect on the front end to make that heavy lift easier. I'm just kind of curious how you all see that process playing out.
Yeah, through the nomination process. And again, we're working on adding clarity to it because there is a lot of information we need. And we are trying to help our stakeholders get that information through the nomination before they nominate. Really, we have to assign designated uses to a water. And that's really one of the things we're going to be asking people to submit is like, what is this water being used for? And once those designated uses are assigned to the water, that's when we can figure out what standards apply to the water. So the team is working on sort of a checklist, potentially an online form and some guidance on how we can get our stakeholders to take more of a leadership role in getting that information to us.
Gotcha. And then that pinged another question for me. Sorry, I should check the chat. Okay, no to questions in the chat. All right. I'm just basically having a lovely conversation about all my questions now. Thank you, Erin. But the question that pinged was, what if it was historically or prehistorically used by humans? How does that play into the protected surface water program?
I think any information you can give is important because for WOTUS purposes, historic use of waters is, considered part of that. That's actually a really big component of a traditional navigable water as well that the Corps looks at. So really, it's one of those throw everything that you have into what you can give us for review, because that is something of a consideration. As far as for the state program, the social, economic, and environmental benefit, we have to do that before we can list a water in the state program if it's a May list water. And we have a lot of May list waters out there. Is it more beneficial to list it under that evaluation than to not list it? Oftentimes, that could be included sort of in that social evaluation of the water is sort of the historic use of the water as well.
Gotcha. Very cool. Awesome. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, but we do have some links that we want to paste in the chat just so that people can follow up. And feel free also, Erin and Colleen, I know Colleen's also joining us from ADEQ, if there's any links you want to post in the chat for folks to be able to follow up. But if anybody missed any part of this talk or wants to go back and listen again, I know I will be doing that. Feel free to visit our website. The recording will be up soon on our coffee breaks link, which Rick will put in the chat. Similarly, if you're interested in becoming a Spring Seeker, you please feel free to reach out to me directly, sarah@skyislandalliance.org, or once again, check out our website. And I'll be digesting some of this information from Erin and thinking about some of the questions that we ask on our Spring Seeker survey and how we might be able to collect some information that would be really helpful to the state for this program. And then the very last thing I wanted to mention is we have a large number of events coming up. So if you want to actually get out to some of our waters with us, and actually visit some of these places and do some restoration work or some work cataloging some of the plants and animals that are out here in our Sky Islands. This month coming up, we have a number of BioBlitz events across the southern part of the state along the border. We also have another coffee break coming up on Arizona's native fishes. That's in early May. And then for all of you folks that are joining us who are volunteers, we have a volunteer appreciation event coming up on May 8th. And those will be up on our website soon as well. But all of that aside, I would just really, really appreciate your time on this, Erin, and thank you so much. I hope everyone on the call right now will join me in thanking Erin for this great talk. And we definitely have a lot to think about moving forward in protecting surface water, thanks to the wonderful work that you and your team are doing. So thank you so much. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful day.